I went in. I am talking about giving you $100 million.
That's not going to do it.
150.
Love to help you, but I can't.
175.
I wish I could. I'm just thinking if it... No.
275. $300 million. How far do we got to go?
If you go above 4, we might have something.
I can do that.
The HBO film Wizard of Lies tells the story of the largest financial fraud in American history, where the deceptions of a single man wiped out the savings of thousands of Americans.
You were never suspicious of your father?
You're asking me how I didn't know? You're the FBI. How did you not know?
Sir!
I don't understand! No shame!
Mr. Madoff, please stand.
In reaction to the film, Rebalance IRA recently gathered an expert panel to discuss how to protect your retirement investments, not just from fraud, but from conflicted financial advice and high fees, the kind of everyday financial abuse that costs investors an estimated $17 billion each year. Rebalance IRA Managing Director Scott Puritz moderated the event and was joined by Congressman Jamie Raskin, Democrat of Maryland, Phyllis Borzi, former Assistant Secretary for Employee Benefits Security of the U.S. Department of Labor, and Elizabeth Kelly, former Special Assistant to the President at the White House National Economic Council. Before the panel discussion, the audience reviewed excerpts from the HBO film.
As with every event of personal devastation, they remember exactly where they were and what they were doing when they learned they were ruined. The grayish-white paper rolled out of Mary Tomajohn's fax machine. The fax was from the small feeder fund she had trusted for 18 years, telling her that all her money had been invested with Madoff, who had been arrested. She later recalled, "In the 50 seconds it took to read that fax, I went from being a multimillionaire to having my life savings wiped out, and life as I knew it altered forever." Robert Hallio's son called him at his retirement home in Boca Raton with the news.
It's all gone, Dad. I don't know what to do.
95% of his wealth had been entrusted to Madoff and was now gone. Tim Murray, a property manager in Minnesota, was traveling and nearly drove off the road when he Fort Lauderdale. Kate Carlack heard the news when Alan Goldstein, Richard Freed, and his new love, David Eyes, Michael DeVito, and never heard from
The man sitting in this courtroom robbed me. He discarded me like roadkill.
What can we possibly say good about Madoff when he sank so low as to steal from Elie Wiesel, as if Wiesel hasn't already suffered enough in his lifetime?
My wife and I are not millionaires. We worked hard for all our lives, and he took our entire life savings.
Mr. Madoff not only defrauded thousands of investors, he mastered the art of manipulating our government.
The money Madoff stole from my family had been set aside to take care of my brother because he's going to need medical assistance for the rest of his life.
If he's attempting to protect his family, he should not be given the opportunity because we, his victims, did not have the same opportunity to protect our families.
You have left your family with a legacy of shame. Your marriage made you in hell, and that is where you are going to return.
I only hope his prison sentence is long enough that his jail cell becomes his coffin.
God's great and mercy.
I am responsible for a great deal of suffering and pain. I understand that. I live in a tormented state, now knowing of all the pain and suffering that I have created. That's something I will live with for the rest of my life. People have accused me of being silent and not being sympathetic. That is not true. I apologize to my victims. I will turn and face you. I'm sorry. I know that doesn't help. Your Honor, thank you for listening.
The message must be sent that Mr. Madoff's crimes were extraordinarily evil. This kind of irresponsible manipulation of the system takes a staggering human toll. Mr. Madoff will get what he deserves and will be punished according to his moral culpabilities. Mr. Madoff, please stand. It is the judgment of this court that the defendant, Bernard L. Madoff, shall be and hereby is sentenced to a term of imprisonment of 150 years. As a technical matter, the sentence must be expressed in months. 150 years is equivalent to 1,800 months. We are adjourned.
First, I'd like to turn the floor over to Elizabeth Kelly. Elizabeth is currently the Chief of Staff for United Income, is that right? Which is part of a startup, a high-powered startup that's part of this wave of innovation that's trying to finally transform the financial services industry into something that's more pro-consumer, greater transparency, of course, lower fees, dramatically better investment products. She came from a stint at the White House where she was a special assistant to POTUS himself, and with a very broad portfolio that included all of economic security, retirement, and played a key role in passage of the fiduciary rule. And in addition, she, even by the standards of Washington, D.C., has an amazing academic credentials. I don't want to embarrass you, but she's a Duke undergraduate, and polished off with Yale Law School, and if that wasn't enough, she got a master's at Oxford. So with that, let me turn the floor over to Elizabeth.
Well, thank you, Scott, for the very kind introduction, and to you, Julia, and the entire Rebalance IRA and HERA Hub teams. I'm excited to be here. I always enjoy talking about saving for retirement and financial education, especially when there's a movie viewing involved. I confess this is actually my second time seeing those clips. I actually watched it the instant it posted on a Saturday night, which probably gives you a window into my level of nerdiness. But anyway, I encourage a full viewing. Wizard of Lies presents a stark scenario where an investment manager was blatantly lying and ripping off his clients in violation of many federal laws, enough to accrue him a 150-year prison sentence. But as Scott said, the sad reality is that many investment advisors are currently ripping off their clients in a way that's perfectly legal, charging higher fees than necessary and steering them towards products that may not be in their best interest. There's two basic types of financial advisors. There's broker-dealers who are held to a suitability standard, and there's registered investment advisors, or RIAs, who are held to a best interest or fiduciary standard. What's the difference between those two standards? The way I like to put it is that if I'm held to a suitability standard, I can't put grandma in tech stocks or something that's clearly inappropriate given her level of risk tolerance. However, I can put her in a mutual fund that charges her higher fees than another available option, but provides me as the advisor a higher commission. The best interest standard would require me to put her in the comparable lower fee investment that would be better for her returns. So basically, advisors that are not fiduciaries, like broker-dealers, may be paid more if they recommend one product over another to their customers, the basic conflict of interest that you'll hear a lot about tonight. On average, conflict of interest results in annual losses of 1% to affected investors. This doesn't sound like a lot, but it can add up. So 1 percentage point lower return could reduce your savings by more than a quarter over 35 years, typical investment horizon. In other words, instead of a $10,000 retirement investment growing to more than $38,000 over this period, you'd end up with just $27,500. Collectively, that adds up to $17 billion of losses by retirement savers every year, as Scott said. The good news is that on Friday, June 9th, the fiduciary or conflict of interest rule requiring advisors to provide advice to their clients in their best interest will go into effect. For the last 3 years, I was fortunate to work closely with Phyllis Borzi and her terrific team at the Department of Labor as they worked round the clock to put into effect these protections for retirement savers, despite substantial opposition from the financial services industry and many politicians. I'll let Phyllis do the honors of telling you more about the rule and the process and politics behind it. But before I turn it over to her, I want to leave you with a few questions I'd encourage you to ask your financial advisor or even your 401k plan administrator. The first one is, are you a fiduciary? Are you committed to recommending investments that are in my best interest for both my tax-preferred and taxable accounts? Tax-preferred ones are things like Roth IRA, your 401k, whereas your brokerage would be a taxable account. The fiduciary rule only applies to those tax-preferred retirement savings accounts, so you're going to want to make sure even after Friday that you're getting best interest advice on both. The second is, what are the total fees I'm paying? First off, what fees am I paying on my underlying investments? What's the expense ratio on the fund? The average is about 0.64%, but Vanguard, BlackRock, others have offerings that can be as low as 5 basis points or 8 basis points. That's 0.05 to 0.08%. The thrift savings plan that many of you may be in if you're federal government employees or have been at some point in time, most of their offerings are from 0.02% to 0.04% as their highest offering. There's no reason to be paying 0.64, and definitely no reason to be paying the upwards of 1% fee that many actively managed funds charge. And I'd encourage you not to look just at the expense ratio, but also at the other fees you might be being charged. Things like 12B1 fees that are charged by the fund to cover marketing or distribution costs, load fees that you might incur if you're selling funds, redemption fees if you sell the fund too soon. Just make sure you're digging into all of this and that your financial advisor is giving you a full picture. You may also be being paid fees around management fees, advisory fees. Even a registered investment advisor may charge 1.5% a year, which starts to add up very quickly. So I encourage you to dig into that. The last question I'd encourage you to ask is what changes you should expect to see in light of Friday's rule and it going into effect. A number of large corporations have announced substantial changes to their practices, the majority of which we think are for the good, but you're going to want to understand what that is. I know this can be a tough conversation. Oftentimes, financial advisors are people who you've had relationships with for many years. One of my favorite stories is there was an academic who did a lot of work on the fiduciary rule and encouraged his mother to switch financial advisors because he discovered that she was in completely inappropriate funds, she was paying too much, and he goes to his mother and says this, and she says, "I can't switch financial advisors, I'd have to switch temples." All that to say, I understand it's a tough conversation, but it's obviously very important for your financial future. So I encourage you all to take on that responsibility. And with that, I'll turn it over to Phyllis.
Well, unless Congressman Raskin, do you want to go?
Please. Yeah.
So
before you mind
sure.
if I could
Oh,
introduce you?
you want to tell people who I am?
Exactly.
I used to
Really?
no introduction.
I want to embarrass you. Phyllis Borzi, among other things, is her resume says, national expert in labor law and employee benefits, and she did a long term at the Department of Labor as Assistant Secretary of Labor, and is generally recognized as sort of the driving force behind the fiduciary rule. But any of us who have had the pleasure of working with her thinks that she's much more than that. This woman is a true American hero, and I don't say that lightly. A true unsung public servant. She has been fighting her whole life for economic justice, before it was fashionable, for really trying to make the financial system work for all Americans. And I just, this fiduciary rule, it was such a David versus Goliath fight, and it's still going on, as we'll hear. But in 2009, Phyllis left a very successful and lucrative private practice as a lawyer, an employment benefits lawyer, to join the Obama administration and as Assistant Secretary of Labor. She had her sights on this fundamental injustice embedded in the original ERISA laws, without getting too Washington geeky, that created this two different standards for investment advisors, a fiduciary standard, which is the proper standard, and a dramatically lower standard. She did all the research, she wrote a draft rule, but she had almost no support. And on the summer of 2011, she went up on the Hill and testified in a legendary hearing, and without the support of the White House yet, without a lot of other support, and it was extraordinarily substantive and research-based, and she put out and her and her team put out a proposal. The industry did not have the ability to fight this on the merits, so they did something really despicable. They attacked Phyllis and her character, and it was just horrible. The pressure built up. There were calls for her to resign. There was extraordinary pressure on the White House going into an election year to fire her, and there's, you know, the financial industries are just have an incredible amount of power and juice in this town. The White House stood its ground. Phyllis stood her ground. It was quite amazing. I had the pleasure of meeting her a few months later in October of 2011. She had heard that we were launching a business to provide Americans with low-cost, high-quality investment options, and that we were part of the solution. She called us into her office, and it was just the week after the first rule had been pulled back. I thought for sure she was going to be dejected, maybe even, I didn't know what to expect. She was leaning in. She was like, "Scott, Mitch, what are you doing? I really hope your firm's a success. We need some success stories, and we're going to go back out. Goddamn, we're going to win this fight." I mean, it was like, being with a great football coach. I mean, it was unbelievably inspirational, Phyllis. Sort of a strategic retreat. I realized at that moment, that Phyllis was not only a fighter, but someone who plays the Washington game just in 3D, chess. It was just really extraordinary. It took multiple years. It took Thomas Perez coming in as being Secretary of Labor in this tremendous alchemy with Phyllis Borzi and her team and Thomas Perez. But in 2015, they went out a second time.
And our president.
And the president.
We couldn't have done it without him.
But it took a lot of convincing, and Elizabeth was part of that story. But April 2016, the rule was promulgated, and it was just an extraordinary profile and courage. So with that.
Well, thank you, Scott. You've now thoroughly embarrassed me, because it makes it sound like this is all me. I certainly will take credit for being the person who cracked the whip over my unbelievably dedicated and talented career people who were committed from the very beginning to do this because it was the right thing to do. I've been watching, probably you all see the commercials. I've been watching the Virginia gubernatorial commercials, and one of the candidates has appropriated something that I always used to say to my staff, which is there's no wrong time to do the right thing. And there's no good time to do the right thing because you're always going to have people who oppose you. But sometimes you just do things in government because it's the right thing to do for ordinary people, and that's why we did this. If I look back on this, the fact is everybody needs investment advice. One of the big problems that we have in this country, and we're not alone because I do a lot of international work and it's true across the world, is that most people are not particularly financially literate. And it has nothing to do with your education level. You can be the most credentialed and brilliant academic scholar, and you still need help in these areas. And as I always said when I went around the country talking about this rule at the beginning, the simple fact is, if you want to buy a refrigerator, you got tools. You can look at consumer reports, you can look at various kinds of things. But if what you want to do is make sure you have a financially secure retirement, there's no GPS to take you there. There's no there's no set of tools. You're sort of on your own. So we all need help, and I'm the first to raise my hand. This is something that I've been working on for 40 plus years, my career. And I need help. And I thought it was pretty amusing to me that my own financial advisor, who I knew, I might add, from the beginning was not actually a fiduciary. But it took him 2 years for me to beat out of him the admission that he wasn't a fiduciary, that he wasn't legally bound to put my best interest ahead of his own. Because he had all these euphemisms. And if you go to the websites of all your financial, all the investment people that you deal with, they all talk about putting you first. And watch the commercials on TV, watch the print ads. So everybody needs advice. But the question for us as consumers is, who can we trust? Now, Elizabeth pointed out the biggest problem, which is there are varying standards of care. There are varying legal standards. And when somebody comes to you and wants to help you, you believe, and all the empirical evidence shows that most consumers absolutely think that giving advice in their best interest is what people are legally obligated to do. But as Elizabeth pointed out, that's not the case. And what this rule does, and the best part of what's going into effect on Friday, even though lots of parts of this rule will not be effective, and even the testimony that the current Secretary of Labor gave today on Capitol Hill suggests that he's ready to gut the rule because of the whining of the financial services industry. But that's a different story. But the fact is, people believe that people who give them advice are acting in their best interest. And often, as Elizabeth's anecdote pointed out, the people who give you advice are people you know. They're relatives, they're neighbors, they're friends, they're people who go to school with you, they're people who go to the same church or synagogue, they're people that you know, and you start with a residual of trust. And it's not like they're bad people. I'm never willing to say, because it's not true. Most people who give advice are in the advice business because they want to be helpful. So it's not like we have a bunch of bad people running around. The problem is the institutional system, where the compensation structure that these individuals who provide retirement advice or financial advice have is they make more money if they push particular products. So one of the things that you need to ask, in addition to the questions that Elizabeth pointed out, is how do you get paid? There are lots of people who get paid by commission, particularly in the insurance industry. And so you're not writing a check to them, but that doesn't mean that they don't get paid. Who do they get paid by? The people whose products they sell you. Now, that may be fine, because it may be that the products are perfectly adequate and really in your best interest. But ask, how are you getting paid? If I'm not writing a check to you, who is? So it's the compensation structure that creates incentives for people who want to do the right thing or who would otherwise do the right thing, but for the way they're paid, the incentives, financial and otherwise, that they get. So really, as consumers, it's hard for us to know, or at least it is until Friday, it's hard for us to know whether the people who are volunteering to help us, whether we pay them directly or indirectly, are actually experts giving us good, solid financial advice, or whether they're just salespeople. And what this rule does is level the playing field. It says if you want to hold yourself out as an expert and give consumers advice, then your legal responsibility, your benchmark, your very basic responsibility is to be legally accountable to put the best interest of your client ahead of everything else. And you know what? There are lots of people in the marketplace that are providing advice today using this fiduciary or best interest standard. The people, as Elizabeth pointed out, who are registered investment advisors, do that. Now, But it's hard for consumers to know. So I've been talking now about the conflict of interest or the fiduciary rule. We started out calling it the fiduciary rule because what we basically did was we proposed a rule to change the definition of who is a fiduciary. The statute, the federal retirement statute, ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974, is very clear, I think, on its face. It says if you offer investment advice to an individual or to a plan, because if anybody in the audience is a small business owner and you have a plan for your employees, a 401k plan or any other kind of plan, you often get advice as to how to set up that plan. What I discovered when I came to the Department of Labor, which is honestly what I sort of knew when I was in private law practice, is that oftentimes small business people are victims because what they do is they often go to their insurance broker or their own personal mutual fund broker, and they ask them for help to set up a 401k plan. But if it turns out that the product that they've been sold or the investment options that they offer their employees in a 401k plan turn out to be either not prudent or otherwise violate the law, and the Department of Labor investigates because your employees have suffered losses, the Department of Labor can't, under the current rules until Friday, go after the people who gave you that bad advice. They can only go after you, and you're just as much a victim as your employees who lost money based on the poor advice that you got. So the industry has always objected to this. The difference between when we put the rule out in 2010, the first time, and as Scott said, I pulled it back in 2011 and we started again, and the rule that we ultimately proposed a couple of years later and then finalized last year, a year ago, April, the difference is we had people like Scott. We had people in the industry. In the beginning, we had uniform opposition. Now, I spent 16 years on Capitol Hill, and I can tell you, my apologies to anybody here in the audience who actually is in the financial services industry, and maybe the Congressman can tell you this as well. The lobbying strategy of the financial services industry the power is remarkable. I used to say when I worked on Capitol Hill, they had more money than God, and they were willing to spend it in less productive ways, that if God was writing checks, maybe God would write it out. But they do need somebody to demonize. That's the strategy, and I was it. Now, for a long time, I was willing to do that, and I, to the end, was willing to do that. But I needed to pull myself out and not be the object of demonizing. And so for the last 18 months or 2 years, I was not the public face of this rule. Tom Perez was the public face of this rule. My political deputy, who had spent her entire 35, 40-year career as a plan fiduciary, she was the investment advisor, the investment manager of large pension funds. They were the public face. Well, what did I do? Did I sit back in my office and do crossword puzzles? No. My job was to work with the career people to make sure that we followed the legal process under the Administrative Procedures Act, which is one of those, very technical rules, but it requires incredible public input and commentary. And we had months and months of public comment. And my job to work with the career staff was to make sure that every comment that was on the public record was read multiple times, including most of them were read by me, which is not usual, the head of the agency reading all these. But we got 250,000 public comments. Most of them were form letters, but still we had to look at all of them. And to make sure that every single issue and argument and data point that was raised by the opponents was thoroughly analyzed by my staff, by the career staff, and then ultimately responded to in writing in the regulation. That meant a veritable forest was killed. of trees so that the regulation could be published. But it also meant that in the 3 courts in which this rule has been challenged by the opponents, we have won every single court case. The opponents of this rule have been unsuccessful in every allegation they made, that we didn't know what we were doing, that we paid no attention to them, that we didn't sufficiently consider the pros and the cons, the cost and the benefits. None of that stuff passed muster with any court, including a court in Dallas in which the plaintiffs, our opponents, forum shopped. It's the court where they thought they would have the most favorable ruling. That judge blew them away. So that's what I was doing for the last year and a half. But what can you do to protect yourself? I think Elizabeth talked about it. Ask people who want to give you advice, are you a fiduciary? And if they waffle, like my guy did, well, of course we care about your best interest. That's not the question I asked you, buddy. If they say yes, then say, will you put that in writing? Get them to acknowledge fiduciary status in writing. If they say no, think about voting with your feet. Make sure that you know how they're compensated. Make sure you know what the fees you're doing. So we've talked tonight about the conflict of interest rule, and I know I'm over time, so I'll be quick now. But another rule that we put out a couple of years, I think it was 2012, was a rule that for the first time, a regulation which for the first time required service providers in the financial services industry to tell the plan sponsors and to individuals who were their customers what fees they were paying.
It's a big deal.
It was like a radical idea that you should know what you're paying. Most people charge bundled fees, so we asked them to unpack it. What are you paying? What services are you getting? How much are you paying for each service? And what exactly are you getting your money for your money? Now, there were 2 parts to it. The first required the vendor to tell the plan sponsor, the small employer in the case of a small employer plan. And then the second part of it required the plan sponsor to pass on not the identical information, but information to actual participants in the plan, its workers, in a way that they could understand. So it isn't just taking all the stuff that your financial people gave you and just passing it through, because nobody would understand that. I didn't even understand half of the stuff myself. So those are some of the things that you should do. I think, although I must say it took me about 20 minutes today working on the DOL website, one of the pieces of guidance we put out when I was at the Department of Labor was a checklist of questions that consumers could use to ask people who wanted to provide financial services to them about what they were providing, what services they provided, how much they would charge, who was paying them, et cetera. If you go to the Department of Labor, it's a very long web address, so I'm not going to give it to you completely. But if you go to dol.gov/EBSA.
We can circulate it afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, it's 2 pages, 2 lines long. We will circulate it. Because it isn't, as I said, even I that sort of knew where it was, couldn't find it. They've reorganized the department's website, and not surprisingly, the information that we put out for consumers seems to be buried somewhere, if not disappeared completely. So I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards. The Friday is a big day. The new definition of fiduciary takes effect, and just the impartial conduct standards, just 3 things. They have to act in your best interest. They can't charge you more than reasonable compensation for the services they provide. And most importantly, they can't mislead you. They can't lie to you about what they're doing. Why the industry still continues to fight those basic principles not until next January were all the details of how you had to accomplish those things, including the kinds of specific disclosures you had to give consumers. Those aren't going to be effective till then. Hopefully, they won't all be watered down or deleted by the current administration. But that's it.
Wow. Well, thank you, Phyllis.
Sorry,
I
just can't be short. I care about this too much.
So I asked the question, who is going to play Phyllis Borzi in the HBO movie? David versus Goliath. So thank you so much, Phyllis. Our next speaker is Congressman Jamie Raskin. Thank you so much for being with us. Those of us who live in Montgomery County, he's our congressman. New to the job, Congressman Raskin had a bruising primary battle and was the underdog and won an incredible primary battle and won the seat. And he's also quite a fighter. Congressman Raskin has a unique combination of boyish charm, intellect. He's very media savvy, progressive politics. It makes him a rising star in the Democratic Party. I mean, he's one of the people for the moment. Prior to being a U.S. congressman, he was a very successful Maryland state senator with a litany of accomplishments, and also for the past 25 years, he's been a professor at American University Law School in constitutional law. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you for organizing this and inviting me and allowing me to participate in the conversation. I thought originally when you invited me, you were looking for my wife because she was the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury Department and she knows about all this stuff and knows Elizabeth and Phyllis and was involved with these guys, and it's great to hear both Elizabeth and Phyllis describe their work. Phyllis said she was on the Hill for 16 years, and I've been on the Hill, I think, for 16 weeks, but it feels like 16 years. But look, the work that everybody up here has done has been essential to making sure that the marketplace is not an arena of scams and rip-offs and predatory action against consumers and investors. And that's what it's all about. I think most of us as Americans believe in a market economy. Not necessarily a market society. Not everything should be governed by market principles, but that for stock investment and business it works, but it's got to be regulated, because if it's not regulated, you get what happened in the 1920s and 30s, and you get what happened in 2008. And we've seen every time what happens with the deregulation and then the bubbles blowing up and the scam artists and the predatory activity, and then the whole thing explodes. And middle-class people across the country are left holding the bag. The 2008 crisis cost 10 million people their jobs and threw 13 million people out of their homes. And it cost the people of the country trillions of dollars in their retirement savings and their pensions and their home equity values. And so joblessness, homelessness, profound economic dislocation and uncertainty that a lot of people still haven't recovered from, even from back in 2008. So it's serious business. And I knew I was going to be late, and forgive me in advance because I'm going to have to leave early too. But I did watch the Madoff movie last night in advance to see the whole thing. And I mean, it's just a terribly sad thing that one, I don't know what you would call him, vindictive, narcissist, sociopath, could cost so many people their life savings and their fortunes. And by the way, one thing that I've noticed, doing hearings on stuff like this and being involved in government, is they do often take place on a kind of community principle, an ethnic or religious, like people will organize in their church or their synagogue or whatever, and people just trust them. They don't ask the hard questions. And then thousands of people, like in the Madoff case, just end up bankrupted or busted because of somebody who everyone said, oh yeah, that's a good guy. He does so-and-so's business. So the fiduciary rule is a very big deal and a great accomplishment. I noticed that the new Secretary of Labor, Mr. Acosta, is already attacking it before it's even come into existence, which is extraordinary, and seems to want to be reviving the APA process to issue a rule revoking it. I would not be surprised if they attempt to legislatively destroy the rule, because that's basically the kinds of legislation we've been voting on ever since we took office in January. Although, I would recommend to my friends across the aisle that they not get involved with this one, because, when the public wakes up to what this means, and you guys have done a great job of explaining to this group, but when they wake up to the fact that, well, now their investment advisors have to have a fiduciary duty to them, which means that's legally enforceable. It's binding. That, before they could say, oh, well, I didn't have a fiduciary duty to you, so I didn't give you the best or second best or third best, but I gave you the fourth best advice, and it didn't work out, but it was reasonable, or,
Suitable.
It was suitable. Then suddenly they had a legal escape hatch, but not now under the fiduciary rule. So if we go to American, we say, well, do you want your investment advisors to have a fiduciary obligation to you, or a fiduciary obligation to their own business or to some other businesses? I think that 99% of the people are going to say, we want the fiduciary duty to run to us. And so, but it could very well happen because, and the reason I know that is because we are voting on what's arguably even a more evil and sweeping piece of legislation this week, which is the so-called Choice Act, which would basically overturn the Dodd-Frank Act, which was the most important piece of consumer protective financial legislation enacted in the United States of America in 75 years. It created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. It instituted a whole host of protections for people's investments across the board. And Wall Street has been agitating for its destruction, and it got out of the Financial Services Committee on a party line vote, and it is coming, the first vote I think we did today, a procedural vote, but they want to vote on it this week to overturn Dodd-Frank. So let me just tell you quickly what's in this legislation. It does wipe out the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which was actually a consolidation. It used to be really fragmented and all over the place. It was at the Fed, it was the comptroller of the currency here, and then they said, let's create, this was Elizabeth Warren's brainchild, remember, to create one bureau that would be a watchdog for consumers against financial scams and rip-offs and hidden fees and so on. And it has already saved $12 billion for, it's saved $36 billion for 12 million people. 12 million people have been saved from $36 billion in scams and rip-offs. That's pretty extraordinary, that it's benefiting, millions of Americans already. And why would we want to get rid of it? It doesn't make any sense. It would also get rid of the Financial Stability Oversight Council, the FSOC, which is a forum for regulators to exchange information about risks in the financial system. It would do away with the so-called Orderly Liquidation Authority. Remember what happened with the financial meltdown, the subprime mortgage crisis, was that the choice was either they would let a bank just completely go bust, or they would bail it out, right? And that was a terrible choice, and so the Orderly Liquidation Authority creates another possibility, which is not an overnight debacle, but a staged liquidation authority. But it also, Dodd-Frank instituted a series of protective measures to make sure banks don't get to that situation by increasing the capitalization requirement so that they've got to have more money within them, and guaranteeing that the banks themselves are engaged in safe practices. There's the Volcker Rule, which basically said that commercial banks could not engage in speculative bets, but had to be engaged in the traditional business of banking. All of this, including stress tests, by the way, on the banks to make sure that they're financially solid, all of this now is up for grabs with this so-called Choice Act. Essentially, it's legislation to turn the clock back on the law to what existed before the 2008 mortgage meltdown crisis. And so far, it is passing with flying colors on a total party line vote as we try to defend the gains that were made for consumers and investors and retirees and pension holders during the Obama administration. So, look, we need a massive campaign for financial literacy in America, and we need it for two reasons. One is so people can protect their own investments and understand what it is that they're getting their money into, and they can make shrewd and prudent and strategic choices consistent with what their financial goals and agenda are. But two, we need massive financial literacy so people as citizens and as policymakers can make the right decisions about legislation and about regulation. And so I'm glad that you're conducting this, and I do seize upon every opportunity I can to tell people that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has saved tens of millions of people money, and it has saved billions of dollars from scams and ripoffs and unfair charges that are out there. And so we got to stop this Choice Act. We've got to get the word out there about that. And you know, the great irony, of course, is that the president campaigned against Wall Street, campaigned against Goldman Sachs, and of course, Goldman Sachs and Wall Street are exceedingly well represented in his administration, and we have a political program which is really at odds with the interests of the vast majority of the American people who are either retirees or planning for their retirement or beneficiaries of retirement plans or trying to figure out what to do with their own investments. So thank you for having me, and thank you for the great work that all of you guys have done.
Great. Well, thank you, Congressman. Really appreciate that. And thought at this point we'd open the floor up for questions if people have questions. And the Congressman does have to leave it at 8:15. So if people have questions for Congressman Raskin, if you could talk into the mic, it'd be appreciated.
That's okay, I have a loud voice. How do you judge what is a reasonable fee? What's reasonable?
Do you want to take that, Liz?
Sure. So I think it depends on what type of product you're looking at and what type of service you're looking at. So, and I'll let Phyllis add more to this. So for something that's just a basic, passively managed mutual fund, as I said, you can get something from Vanguard, BlackRock, if you wanted an exchange-traded fund, for somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 20 basis points.
Almost free.
Yeah, that's
very inexpensive.
Exactly, that's 0.05% to 0.2%, so very low. If you're looking at something that's an active,
And those funds are doing well for that reason?
they're doing
People-
phenomenally well.
Yeah.
There's been a huge flow into passive funds. If you were looking for something that was an actively managed fund.
Maybe you should make sure that,
You wanna go
you might want to explain what a passive
I'll
fund
let you go
versus an
ahead.
active.
Sure.
So a passive fund is an index fund where there isn't a manager who decides, let's buy this, let's sell this. It's designed around an index. So there are a lot of people who don't like passive funds because they don't get to try to use what they think is their immense financial skills to figure out what's going to be up and what's going to be down. But for most investors who really just want to make sure that the money that they don't lose their principal, the passive funds are sort of move with the market. The active funds, and there's lots of active funds, particularly in the 401k marketplace, more and more passive funds have been selected by employers because they're easier for people to understand. But the active funds, you have actual managers, and they will look at the portfolio and they will say, okay, we probably need to put in more tech stocks, or we might want to change between healthcare. You know, one of the things there are some people who think that Obamacare was a job killer. As one of my other hats that I wore at the Department of Labor, as I was in charge for the department in implementing Obamacare. And I can tell you it was not a job killer, it was a job generator, because the health services jobs were off the chart in terms of generating new jobs. So, you know, maybe we think that the health sector is going to be better. So they actually, as their name implies, there's a manager that actually actively selects the stocks that are part of the portfolio. And that's basically.
If
Scott,
I can add.
You probably can add.
Yeah, I mean, 20 or 30 years ago, active managers who had special information markets weren't that efficient. The top 5% could beat the market. Our capital markets now are so extraordinarily efficient that study after study shows that any period of time beyond 5 years, passive index funds beat active, and to the tune of 95% of index funds beat active management over any reasonable period of time. So why would you not do that for any investor?
Active management funds charge higher fees,
Right.
obviously, because you're paying somebody to manage.
Exactly. So like a lot of the consumer groups have said that less than 1% is actually a pretty good price for an actively managed fund, would give you an indication of just how high most of their fees are versus the almost nothing you can pay for the passive ones.
Vanguard's S&P 500 or iShares, I mean, they're terrific building block products.
And your comment earlier, Elizabeth, about the federal thrift savings plan is right on target. You know, I use when I go and listen to broker presentations, and I do that sometimes because I'm old, so I get all these free lunches, free dinners. I don't go for the free meal. I go to hear what the pitch is. And whenever somebody, and of course in this area, it's hard to go to one of these things where there aren't federal employees. Are there federal employees or retired federal employees here in this one? Okay, so the deal is that this is the largest 401k plan in the world because of the size. And it also charges the lowest fees in the world. So if you go to one of these retirement seminars, or if you're close to retirement, and your broker or your advisor suggests that he or she could get a better deal for you outside of the federal plan, don't take it. Because it is impossible, and I'm telling you, impossible, for anybody making in the marketplace to beat the fees that are charged with respect to the federal employees.
And the return.
And the return, yeah. Well, of course, the thing is that the lower the fees, the higher the return. That's what's so irritating about this conflict of interest rule. The people that are victims here are the people who've done the right thing and who've saved for retirement. If your people, as Elizabeth and I worked very hard in the administration to try to encourage people to save, and the private sector has as well. But these people that are victims in this particular area are the people who have done well, the people who have done the right thing and have saved. And for every dollar that goes to somebody else in fees, that's $1 less that you get in return. So it's a direct transfer from your pocket to the pocket of somebody else.
And if I can add, in most things you think, well, if I pay more money, I'm going to get a better product.
Yeah,
in investing, it's just the opposite. The single largest, the most accurate variable in terms of long-term return is low fees. The higher the fees, the lower the long-term return. In study after study, there's 50 years of data on that.
Thanks.
Sir.
Appreciate hearing from all of you. It's been very interesting. With regard to fees, I think you answered what might be reasonable in terms of investment in funds. What about a case where your investment advisor does not purchase funds, but instead takes your IRA and your savings and buys individual securities and bonds? What would you consider to be a reasonable fee for that sort of advice?
Well, the question is why they do that. I mean, we're believers in the long-term power of indexing, and as our investment committee, who are,
But there is one point, your question isn't directly on this, but it's a point I want to make. So normally when we talk about this, we talk about mutual funds and those kinds of investments. But a lot of you have the opportunity to buy annuities, to convert your lump sum when you retire into a monthly stream of income. And one of the things that we both have worked very hard on the policy area is to encourage people to think about long-term income. Back in the old days, when my father retired, he knew that his pension, that he had a pension, and he had a defined benefit pension, which meant that he was going to get his benefits over his lifetime and my mother's lifetime on a monthly basis. So annuity products are more expensive than mutual funds or some of these more liquid assets, because what you're paying for is a premium for that guarantee that you're going to get that stream of income, whereas you don't get it. Now, it's very hard. I don't know that I could even have the expertise to begin to tell you about what to pay, what's a reasonable fee for an annuity product. Because
I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in if the people,
Yeah.
you
Let
give
me-
your money
I can
to
answer your question.
investment advisors.
Sure.
They
Right.
buy stocks, they don't buy funds.
Yeah, it's-
And they buy bonds.
Sure.
Individual bonds,
a
like
good-
Pennsylvania munis or whatever.
Sure. A good investment advisor should do much more than just investment management. That's a part of their responsibility. But there also is planning, and that's a very important function. The norm has been 1% to 1.5%. My firm, Rebalance IRA, is part of trying to transform investment advice. We charge 0.5%, so really half of the norm. And we think that that's, more than adequate for that type of activity.
it varies
buying
geographically too,
individual
doesn't
stocks
it?
is much more risky than buying one of these pooled mutual funds.
Scott, forgive me, can I excuse myself?
Sure.
I just want to say, but just before I go, obviously, I'm not here to make any recommendations on financial advice. You wouldn't want any of my recommendations anyway. But I just want to give you the civic advice. Please stay engaged with these issues, not just at the personal level, but at the policy level. We need you to be paying attention to what's going on. And there was one statistic I was looking for before, which I found, which is that the CFPB has benefited 26 million Americans who've already benefited from it, and with an estimated $12 billion saved from scams and ripoffs out there. So.
Thank you so much, Congressman.
Totally my pleasure.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
All right, we got a question in the back.
Yeah, I have a question.
We could talk into the mic.
Are the strong points that
Am I just saying?
opposition to the fiduciary rule are trying to make to convince otherwise?
Well, there are two. I'll start with two, and then maybe Elizabeth and Scott can jump in. The question was, what are the major points that the opponents make against the rule? And these are the same talking points that they've used from day one. The first is because our rule only affects retirement savings, not taxable savings. The consumers are going to be confused as to what standard applies, best interest or something else. Well, the simple answer to that is the consumers are incredibly confused now. What this does is create a benchmark for all retirement savings. There's nothing to say that your advisor or your broker can't use a best interest standard for your taxable accounts as well. And that is, as Elizabeth points out, one of the questions you should ask them. So that's one, this consumer confusion argument. But probably the argument that has generated the most sympathy, if you will, on Capitol Hill is an argument that says, well, if the Department of Labor requires this best interest standard that we can't, that small savers, people with small accounts, small employers, we won't be able to serve them anymore because it's too expensive to serve small savers. Well, listen to that. It's, first of all, if you look at the data, and we spent a long time actually looking at the data, if you look at the data, small savers are not generally served in the current marketplace anyway. 40% of all the people who seek advice get it from friends and family. And what we saw in the last 2 years is the major wirehouses, the major broker dealers, are cutting commissions for their salespeople, for their advisors who service accounts less than $250,000. So they don't even want to, even before the rule is effective, they don't want to deal with these small accounts. Second, if you have $10,000 or $20,000 to invest, what kind of advice do you need anyway? Elizabeth and Scott just gave you the advice. Go to index funds, go to mutual funds. You don't need somebody advising you to put your money in real estate or gold or any of these more exotic products. But third, there are lots of people out there in the marketplace that serve small employers and small savers. And they're doing very well economically. I mean, if you think about this argument, it's really economic. What the financial services companies are saying is, we can't make enough profit unless we rip people off.
The legacy financial,
Yeah.
The historic.
The big
yeah.
ones.
We're part of those.
Well, and that's why I was so excited when Scott and his partner came in to talk to us about their approach. Now, I don't want to be endorsing anybody, but there are a lot of people in the marketplace, and one of the things that this rule has done is stimulate innovation in the marketplace for people who want to deliver services to small account holders. You know, you've probably heard about these robo-advisors, and the traditional legacy folks scorn these robo-advisors. Oh, do you want to be serviced by a computer? That's not what the robo-advisors are all about. And by the way, the big guys, they direct you to a call center. Isn't that, a form of, it's not necessarily online, but so this business about we're going to leave small businesses behind and small savers behind, you might ask yourself, when you look at who supports the rule and who opposes the rule, the people who support the rule are groups like the Consumer Federation of America, AARP, Americans for Financial Reform, the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, all of the women's groups. So all of the people who traditionally, over their whole existence, have supported consumers are in favor of this rule. Who are opposed to this rule? The financial institutions, by and large, who have made a lot of money. I'll tell you this one little story. When I first started on this project with my career staff in 2009, right after I was confirmed by the Senate, I thought we were onto something. I thought there was a problem. And as the opposition continued to generate more and more opposition, and were willing to spend, at least what the press reported, tens of millions of dollars to stop us, I began to think, we are onto something even bigger than I thought. Because if they just took that money and developed better products, cheaper, more effective, more efficient, more transparent products, the consumers would be better off. So this is a long-winded answer, but those are the two things.
Just to add quickly, as Phyllis said, I totally agree that the small savers argument was the one that we heard the most, and it was also the most disingenuous to me. Tom Perez used to tell the story of he got a call from some CEO of a historic financial company who was complaining that he would no longer be able to serve small savers. And he said, just out of curiosity, what is your minimum account balance in order to just take on a customer? And he said, $1 million. And at that point, I think he stopped listening. I think what's really remarkable is the number of new entrants that we're seeing into this field, even since the 2011 rule, and the way that technology is enabling lower cost advice for people with smaller balances, not just through, direct to consumer computer-based systems, but also by enabling individual financial advisors to do their own jobs more effectively. So there's a variety of different services available in the market, and you guys are clearly one good example of that. The other argument that we heard that always bugged me was this idea of limiting choices.
Oh.
There was a press conference or press call not too long ago where a senior Trump administration official said that this was all about limiting choices. It was like trying to only let people eat healthy food. And my question was, who wants unhealthy investment products? Right. I didn't quite understand that one.
Well, actually, if you watch, one of the advantages of being a retiree now is that I have a lot of free time on my hands, and so I get to watch C-SPAN a lot more than I did before. And so I actually watched when our new president signed not an executive order, but even something of less significance called a presidential memorandum, but he did it with such panache that you thought he'd changed the world. And he couldn't quite explain. This was the presidential memorandum in which he directed the Secretary of Labor to revisit this issue and take into consideration. He couldn't quite explain what it was that he was signing. Somebody had obviously written something because he was looking at this card, but he couldn't, so he just took the pen and he handed it to this woman who was standing behind him, who turned out to be Congresswoman Ann Wagner, who has, as she said at that event, I've made it my life's work. Well, this is somebody who's only been in Congress for a few years, so maybe she's had a short life, but I've made it my life's work to stop this rule because it denies consumers choice. Well, go ahead, you might as well finish.
No, all I was going to say is we're actually seeing the opposite. There are good new products being developed. So take annuities, which are a great way to provide lifetime income in a way that many people have not been able to access in a world in which defined benefit pensions are sadly declining. The consumer groups have noted that there's a lot of low-cost annuities that have been rolled out since the fiduciary rule was announced, and we think it's going to actually expand choices and help create product innovation.
And when we issued the final rule, we got criticized by some of the consumer groups. In the proposal that we issued, we had limited the products that could be offered using this special exemption under ERISA. And we did that because there were some products that we thought just probably aren't good for consumers. And we were roundly criticized. And in the end, we bowed to the industry pressure and we said, any product, the only important thing is recommending this particular product in the best interest of the customer. But you can recommend, so if anything, we didn't limit choices at all. Now, we did limit choice in this respect, that a customer, and I don't know that I'd call it limiting choice, but the customer cannot choose, I guess they could, but we've assured customers, because we want them to seek advice, that everybody who gives advice has to meet this best interest standard. It is true that we've limited choice, but it isn't the choice of the consumer. It's the choices of the advisors, because today, under these circumstances, they can choose to either give you fiduciary advice or non-fiduciary advice. You just don't know what their choice is in most instances. So Ann Wagner was correct. We have limited choice, but not consumer choice, just the choice of the people giving you advice.
I'm pretty sure that I pay too much for an actively managed fund or account. I've been told for a long time, switch to Vanguard, they do better. What I would really like is to figure out who I talk to help me through this, because it's one thing to know it, it's another to do it. And even when you go to look at Vanguard, there are so many funds to choose from. Is there such a thing as a person who you can pay by the hour to walk you through what you have?
Yes, the answer is yes.
And how do you find that kind of person?
They are registered investment advisors. I I'm not sure how you.
We're a registered investment advisor.
Right.
Good.
What I was going to say is the one piece of this puzzle that several of you have asked about is, as the government, as the Department of Labor, what we didn't have the capacity to do in our fee disclosure rule. We had the authority to require people to tell you what the fees were. We didn't have either the authority or the resources to be able to go the next step and say, and this is what a reasonable fee would be. So, but there are a couple of private sector entrepreneurs who are busy collecting this information, and you can use, and they're on their websites, but the RIAs typically know how to get to them, and they can give you this comparison. You know, another regulation that will probably never see the light of day in this new administration is an expansion of the data that annually pension funds have to file with the Department of Labor. We asked that in this new proposal we made, that remember I told you that the financial institutions have to tell people what fees they're charging for what services? We asked that disclosure be attached to this reporting form so that there would be more innovation in the marketplace, more private sector people could figure out how to compare. And it was one of the first things that, even before the Obama administration ended, that they were opposed to. But go to a registered investment advisor, an RIA, and they'll be able to help you.
Yeah. There's two pieces to this. One is the investment management and making sure that either you or the advisor you're working with is using low-cost building blocks. And then there's the legitimate advice piece in terms of constructing the right portfolios and matching it to your needs and putting a plan in place for you. And most registered investment advisors who are on their game are very good at that and add legitimate value. The question is how much you pay for that.
And certified financial planners, that's the other thing. You know, one of the other things that makes it hard for consumers to know is this is an industry, this advice industry, in which the barriers to entry are very low. Anybody can hold themselves out as an expert here. Anybody can have a business card printed up. And it's very interesting to me to see these business cards with lots of initials. I never can figure out what all these initials are. But a CFP, Certified Financial Planner, and an RIA, those are things to look for.
We have time for one more question. In the back there? Yeah, you, yes.
Okay. So I have a question because I'm in an advice-giving profession as well.
Could you? Oh, sorry. I'm in an advice-giving profession as well. I do family and divorce mediation. And as an attorney and knowing what is happening in the profession, there are rules about telling parties what their options are. So as I'm hearing what this rule requires, transparency, disclosures about fees and so forth, most consumers are not informed. They're not attending forums like this where they're learning about where they could get lower cost and better services that meet their interests. And so what's key is how the options are presented in the transparency. So I'm curious about meeting the fiduciary responsibility by saying, here's what the fees are, but also spinning it to say, and if you don't get protection or good advice from me and you go use one of these robo or online processes, then you'll be unprotected and it will hurt you and you'll lose So part of it is really how it's spun, not so much whether they're meeting the legal requirements of describing transparent, being transparent and saying, I'm meeting my fiduciary responsibility?
One of the biggest issues we dealt with was exactly that issue. There were many, the prior guidance from the Department of Labor had carved out from fiduciary responsibility education. If what you were doing is not making recommendations, but you were just educating people, you would do one of those retirement seminars, or you could be one-on-one, and you'd say to people, well, somebody of your age with your risk tolerance, this is sort of the way you should allocate your assets, and not saying, do this. That was a bit of guidance that was put out by the Department of Labor, by my old agency, in 1996. And what we discovered from 1996 until we finally fixed it in the regulation, but it's not, all these changes are not effective until next year, assuming they survive this process that the administration is going through. Because this is one of the big areas that the industry has targeted to weaken the rule. What we said is, if you give examples, or here's how I would always describe it. At some point in these conversations, the customer is going to say to the person giving advice, not, what should somebody of my age and risk, they're going to say, what should I do? And once you start answering that question about what I should do, you've crossed the line. And it's not education, it's fiduciary advice, and you're subject to the rule. It was enormously difficult to create some bright line tests in that. So you've identified one of the big problems. But the industry, there were major players in this industry who, you all know their names, you see their commercials, most of you probably have investments in them. They took the position, now I wasn't present at the meeting at the White House in which they said this, but I was present at the meeting at the Department of Labor when they tried it on us. They took the position that nothing they do vis-a-vis clients is advice, that it's all education. That was like, didn't even pass the guffaw test.
If I can add.
That's the fiduciary, meeting their fiduciary responsibility.
Under this rule, they are treated as fiduciaries.
If I can add, a fiduciary responsibility is just a minimum bar. It's like a Hippocratic oath, or some of the responsibilities and obligations you have in your profession. You can meet the fiduciary oath and not be a good advisor and provide lousy advice. It's just a minimum standard that it's a level playing field. But again, as in any other profession, there are good and bad and okay professionals, even if they're discharging their responsibilities in a legally binding way.
That's why part of what we took so seriously was trying to build public awareness around these issues. And I think it was really heartening to see the tremendous amount of press coverage, the number of how-to guides that have sprung up, continuing the HBO theme. John Oliver even did a 20-minute segment on this, which I highly recommend if you haven't seen it. Yeah. A certain financial institution that will go unnamed took the ill-advised decision of trying to sell John Oliver's employees a ridiculously high-priced 401k plan, which then ticked them off so much they did an entire episode. It's really worth watching.
It's really worth watching. There is, if I can make just one point about the Madoff film. Reporters at the beginning when we started this process, because we were one of the agencies that was pursuing Bernie Madoff, reporters would say, well, even if we did this conflict of interest rule, how would that stop a Bernie Madoff? And the answer is, if somebody's going to lie to you, I don't know how you stop that. But the thing that strikes me as I watch that Bernie Madoff film is how different, people said to us, how many times did you hear this, Elizabeth? Well, the way to deal with personalizing this issue is get some victims to come forward. The thing that struck me about that Madoff film is that it illustrated the difficulty. This is not a problem that people are aware of. I mean, it's not like you look in your bank account and you think you should have $10,000 and you have $4,000. It's not until you retire and you think about how much more you could have had if your investments had earned more money that you even begin to suspect. Most people don't suspect, they trust their advisor. They don't even realize that they're victims. And the ones that do, because we did have some examples of people who, particularly right in the period right after 2008, who went to financial advisors who basically took all their money and put it in risky stuff, and they pretty much wiped them out. We did have some of those examples. Those people, the courage it took for those people to come forward, because people are just so embarrassed. They think, I'm a smart person. How could I be bilked by my son or my minister or whatever? And so the Madoff story does tell you something about the willingness of people to trust other people. And that's why we think it's so important that before you put your trust in someone, you should be assured that that person has a legal obligation to look out for you. So.
Okay, with that, we've clocked out. Thank you very much, the two of you, and thank you, everyone. Great questions and great answers. This was great.